Hello, everyone. Today, our press conference is dedicated to the 80th anniversary of World War II, beginning of the World War II. And we are having our first DPR, Dmitry Polyansky, as a speaker. Your Excellency, you have the floor.
The topic of our press conference might sound a little bit academic, and I am absolutely sure that many of you wondered what was the idea of bringing this topic to the press conference. I am historian by background a little bit because I have very bad memory at names and at dates. That's why I chose to be historian. I was struggling with this during my whole academic life, but I managed to remember at least something from the subjects that I was taught. And I understand that history is really a very important subject because it embraces everything. It has connection to arithmetic, to physics, to music, to culture. So this is the mother of subjects, if I can say so. In my country, we pay very much attention to history. History is not a very easy topic. It reflects the political situation in this or that region of the world. Some people approach it from the position that was once pronounced by Napoleon, that history is a number of lies, and these lies change with the epoch and with the government. We don't think it's a number of lies because there are historic facts that can be proven, and that really can matter very much. So this is exactly the case with the event that triggered my press conference. On the 1st of September, we will mark the 80th anniversary of the bloodiest war in our history, and hopefully it is the last war in our history by such extent. So the number of victims differ, but I think average calculations show that about 55 million people became victims of the Second World War, and more than half of this number is victims from former Soviet Union member states. There were a lot of civilian victims, 2/3 of the whole number, but also military victims. That's why, of course, in my country, it's very difficult to find a family that is not affected by this event. That's why we, people living in Russia, we are very much on alert all the time when historic events are being discussed and when the issue of the Second World War or Great Patriotic War, as we consider that started from the 22nd of June 1941, is being discussed. I also need to say that I worked, at some point of my career, I worked in Poland for 3 years, and I was honored to serve there when the 70th anniversary was marked. And it was a very difficult endeavor for everybody, difficult political endeavor, because political situation in Poland was not easy. Our relations were also not at the best level. But at the same time, we managed to guarantee the presence of then Prime Minister Vladimir Putin in Westerplatte, who delivered a wonderful speech there, and he had very good meetings with Polish leadership. So this was kind of breaking the ice in our relations at this time. That's why I personally was very much bewildered when I learned that for 80th anniversary, the Polish presidential spokesman announced that Russia is not invited there. It's not the fact that we want to be invited everywhere, but we were very much puzzled by this, because this is only 10 years have passed since last time we were about to mark such an event, but it clearly shows how big the transformation in the world has gone during these 10 years, and what is the difference now in the attitude towards this historic event. And this is very alarming. That's why we really wanted to bring this issue to your attention. History, of course, remains history, but a lot of political actions or inactions or declarations are usually based on historic events. So there are a lot of facts that are in the basis of our perception of the beginning of the Second World War, and the depth of your analysis usually is defined by the conclusion to which you want to come at the end of this analysis. So if you just start your analysis with the fact that on the 23rd of August 1939, Soviet Union and Nazi Germany signed non-aggression pact, then of course your vision of history is predefined. But this is a very shallow analysis, which is dominated today, unfortunately, in Eastern Europe and in Poland in particular. In order to understand the context of these events, we must dig further, and we need to understand that at this time in Europe, maybe 5-7 years before the beginning of the Second World War, it was absolutely clear that war with Hitler was inevitable, and the policy of great states at the European continent was very much determined by the way how to avoid the war, how to avoid participation in the war, and how maybe to get the biggest benefit from the fact that you will not be attacked first, and maybe you will not be touched by this war at all. So a lot of politicians at this time were absolutely clearly hoping that there will be war between Soviet Union and Nazi Germany, and these two states will annihilate themselves, and it will be a new opening for the world. So there were a lot of these primitive theories, and they were hoping that in such a scenario the other countries will be spared. But it was absolutely clear that the policy of the appeasement of Hitler led to the situation when Hitler became more and more powerful, and it was inevitable at some point of time, and the Soviet leadership, of course, understood that we were deemed to make certain diplomatic moves to avert immediate beginning of the war. So in 1939, there was a big danger that we would have to fight Nazi Germany since the first day. It is, of course, necessary to say that there were a lot of efforts at this time in Europe especially from our part, to form some anti-Hitler coalition and to mobilize efforts to give common response to this threat. And these were very active efforts. We had negotiations first and foremost with France and United Kingdom, but to no avail. There were political reasoning behind this. Nobody was very much fan of Soviet Union at this time, and they had their own interests. And of course, we need to remember the Munich Agreement of 1938, the result of which Czechoslovakia was absolutely betrayed by Western powers, and a lot of countries participated in the partition of Czechoslovakia, including Poland, by the way. So I'm giving you this picture not because I want to give you a lecture of history, but I want to tell you that in order to understand the events at this time, you need to look at them through the eyes of those who were living at this time. Because if we analyze them through our positions, through our concepts of today, we will inevitably get a wrong perception of what was happening. So from the point of view of politicians at this time, and from the point of view of standards, of moral standards of politics at this time, any non-aggression pact between the states, any non-aggression pact with Hitler was something very common and very achievable. They were not analyzing it through the eyes that we have today. So there were non-aggression pacts of Hitler, Germany with Poland. The Baltic states were also signing agreements with Hitler. Soviet Union tried very hard to maintain their neutrality, but it was not achieved. So everybody was trying to achieve certain safeguards against Hitler at this time. Some of them successfully, some of the countries, some not. But Soviet Union was not avoiding this diplomatic exercise as well. So this famous Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was also part of our efforts, and we analyze it through this lens. It was stated several times, including by President Putin in Gdansk 10 years ago, that this pact was a mistake. Of course, everybody makes mistakes, and at this point there were a lot of mistakes. But on the other hand, this mistake allowed us, according to the calculations of many historians, to avoid waging immediate war with Hitler. And there are very many studies right now, these days, that you can read, and you will understand the reasoning that Soviet leadership had by entering into negotiations with Hitler and by marking this pact. I will not tire you with the details, but there was logic behind this, and there were practical dividends. So a lot of people consider today that if Soviet Union didn't do this step, then Hitler would have had easier opportunity to take Moscow and Leningrad, and the war would be over very soon. But this helped a lot. Of course, you never know. Right now, there is no conjunctive mood for history, but serious politicians and serious historians are really showing into this direction. So again, coming back to the 1st of September, a very tragic day. Poland became the first victim of the Second World War. This country had a terrible fate. A lot of Poles were killed. And of course, Holocaust was very much present in Poland at this time. So we really wanted, and we continue to want to share our feelings with everybody on this tragic day, and to say the words how much we remember these events, and how much we really want to avoid any of such situations in the future. But we were deprived of this opportunity. This time, when presidential spokesman of Polish presidential office was asked why Russia was not invited, on the other hand, Germany is invited and United States is invited. So the answer was like this: we are not analyzing this event through historic perspective. We are analyzing it through current today's politics. And this is very dangerous. This is exactly what we really want to avoid: politicization of history and falsification of history and glorification of those who do not deserve to be glorified. And that's why we risked to raise this topic today in front of you, because there are very many cases, very many situations when history is being rewritten, when those who were collaborating with the Nazis are becoming heroes. I can cite you a lot of examples in today's Ukraine, for example, the situation that really deserves very much attention, and I know that there are a lot of signals from diplomatic missions there in Kiev to the authorities of Ukraine that really what's going on is something intolerable. But for political reasons, it is not very widely publicized. There is such a trend also in Baltic states, where the Waffen-SS, the brigade that was created in 1943 by the decree of Hitler, is now also treated as heroes, and this is totally to the contrary of the decision of Nuremberg Tribunal. So this is a trend that we always were condemning, and this year I think we really saw that the events, the political situation now in some of the Western countries dictates and defines the fact that they are even more eager to rewrite history and to change the attitude towards recent or not recent historic events. I tried to find out opinion polls about what is now the perception of events of the Second World War. They're numerous, not very many of them are illustrative. But, for example, recent opinion poll in France, who was the who gets the most credit for victory over Hitler? So in 1945. 70% of French, more or less, were responding that it was Soviet Union. About 20 that it was United States, and the rest UK. Now the situation is totally opposite. 70% United States, 20% Soviet Union. For UK, it remains more or less the same. So this is also very illustrative. The poll was conducted a couple of years ago, but I think that today the trend is even more alarming. So this bears fruit, this bears result. People now, especially young people, are more and more ignorant about who started the war, who you were fighting with. If you look at computer games, I was really astonished when some children of my friends showed me computer games where about Second World War, where United States was fighting Soviet Union actually in the Second World War together, Soviet Union together with Nazi Germany. Of course, it's simulation. If we ask them the questions, they say, "Oh, come on, this is a game." But children play these games and they will remember. So they were fighting as Americans, Soviets, and Nazis, and for them this is also no difference. And this is also a very important point. When I was starting my work in Poland, the trend of putting on the same level Nazi Germany and Stalinist Soviet Union was very weak. A lot of Poles really say that both regimes affected great damage to their country. They have some reasons to think so, but this is questionable. Nevertheless, it was very, very low voice situation. Now, I think it's more and more frequent when people say it doesn't matter. So, on the one hand, it was one totalitarian regime. On the other hand, another totalitarian regime. They both cracked Poland and they started the war. So it doesn't matter very much. This is the logic that is more and more voiced. I want to tell you that this is not true. You can have whatever attitude towards Soviet Union. You can have whatever attitude towards communist ideology and Stalinist ideology, but it's not equal, far from being equal to Nazi ideology. I will give you only one reason. In Nazi ideology, there is one nation that is put above every other nation. And the main idea, the main task of Hitler was to win, to get more space for Aryas, and all the other nations were considered to be slaves or inferiors. I'm not mentioning, of course, Jews, Gypsies, and some other nations. In Soviet ideology, which was also totalitarian, of course, but in Soviet ideology, everybody was equal. Even such notion as nationalities was not almost not existing. In Soviet passports, it was not obligatory to put nationality because it was a Soviet people. So the idea was to start a world revolution and to liberate everybody, to liberate from bourgeoisie, from capitalism. Again, I'm not saying is it good or bad, but this is a different type of ideology. It's ideology in favor of liberty, in favor of making people free. Very many people will say that it is questionable, but still the ideologies are very much different. That's why we always oppose this very false starting point that these two regimes were equal. And again, of course, another trend which is very worrying is that now some historians are saying, oh, it was not so difficult for Soviet Union to defeat Nazi Germany because, well, first of all, it was frost. Then there were dimensions. Now we heard that that Soviet tanks were very bad, and actually there were a lot of chances that we won in Kursk battle. So there are more and more situations like this, and this is also a trend. And I just want to remind you the figures: 27 million people died in the Soviet Union. And it was enormous losses to my country. It was enormous effort for several years. You can read plenty of these things in the internet and elsewhere. This is very sad for us to hear such things, and this is a very sad situation for us when we learn that our country is being omitted for such important celebrations. This is not an insult to us, of course. We can make our own events dedicated to this date, and we will speak. This is an insult to the whole of Europe, to the memory of those who were fallen. This is insult to Poles themselves, because only in Poland there are 600,000, even more, Soviet soldiers that died there, and there are graves of this number of soldiers. And of course you can't betray the memory of those who came there, who were absolutely sincere in their desire to liberate this land from fascism, and we need to respect their memory. And this is kind of disrespect. So I really wanted to limit myself to this. If you have any questions, I would be very happy to answer.
I think we'll start from Evelyn. Evelyn, thank you.
Thank you very much. I too follow history of World War II. Evelyn Leopold, Independent Media Institute. I agree with you that, or with the people who say that who won the war, that the Soviet Union had the largest share of both victory and suffering. But what amazes me now, well, two questions. First of all, I'm amazed that the Poles 10 years ago invited the Russian Federation, because they did suffer under the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. And I just thought it was unusual that they would have done that. But my real question is that you have a big anti-fascist campaign as a result of the World War II victory. Yet the Russian Federation is backing far-right parties in Europe, West and East. When it's Marine Le Pen in France, some representative of the Alternative in Germany, the Freiheit Freedom Party in Austria, founded by ex-SS men. There are people in each group who fall into neo-fascist tendencies. Why aren't you doing an anti-fascist campaign in Western Europe, or Europe also, because it's your legacy?
So, in a sense, this is one question.
Yeah.
Okay, I will answer it. First of all, it's very difficult to classify all the far right, as you put this movement, as, for example, Nazi movements.
No,
So if
people among them.
yeah, there are some people, but no problem. I hear you well. But I have not heard that they were marching along the streets with Nazi symbols, with Nazi symbolica, with the lanterns that are being lit like it was in 1933. On the other hand, in Kiev they do so. They have Nazi emblems, they have Nazi symbols. It's quite clear, and nobody pays any attention to this. So again, it's very questionable. I would doubt very much what you say, that these are neo-Nazi groups. There are neo-Nazi groups, and we are not cooperating with them at all. Again, your suggestion or your assumption that we back these movements. What do you mean by back? These
€1,000 to Le Pen.
so it's something new for me, really.
Sorry,
Yeah, it's something new for me.
Yes, in the last election in France, enormous amount. I'm not saying that they are fascists, neo-fascists, but there's certainly people amongst them who are quite open about it. And you don't want to create a 1930s again.
Absolutely not. But you also need to take into consideration with one fact. It takes two to tango. So if somebody wants to speak with us, we are ready to speak with them. I haven't heard about many European parties right now that wouldn't be afraid to speak with Russia, and that would propose to speak with Russia, and that would voice understanding of our reasoning and our politics and so on and so forth. So it would be unwise for us not to notice this. And again, if we take, for example, Le Pen's movement in France, this is not marginal movement. She was presidential candidate, so her policies and her party program was very much analyzed. If it were about neo-Nazism, I'm absolutely sure that the French would have forbidden it. So these are marginal within the marginal, and we are not supporting this. Our position is quite clear, no ambiguity for this. By the way, I forgot to mention that we are introducing every year a special resolution in the General Assembly for against glorification of Nazism and in support of combating any forms of xenophobia and extremism. And guess who is voting against this resolution? United States and Ukraine. So a lot of abstentions because the European Union has specific positions, but most countries support this. Okay?
Hi, yes, thank you. Question, you're about to take over the Security Council presidency, so I'd like to ask you about a conflict.
We're done with history.
Well, I'd like to ask you about a conflict that's currently on the Council agenda. Syria, Russia has announced a ceasefire in Idlib to start on Saturday. Can you give us more details?
I will, but I'm sorry, if we can finish with history and then maybe a couple of issues like this, okay? I just don't want to interrupt the narrative. I'll come back to your question. So please, about history.
Yes, well, I have two questions. One of them is about history, and the second one is about the current situation in Syria. But my question...
one goes there.
Yes. You mentioned how before Second World War there was the appeasement by Soviet Union to Hitler, then suddenly...
Appeasement by European states, not by Soviet Union.
Yes, and how it was done in order to make sure Hitler won't attack them, then suddenly Germany attacked Soviet Union. How is this fear, this historical fear is explaining your anti-NATO policies in Eastern Europe right now, and how much of that is explaining your policy in Syria? Is your policy in Syria is within that same paradigm of self-defense, or, as your critics say, it's a new kind of expansionism of Russian influence in the broader regions?
I really don't see these issues through the same optics as you see. So very briefly on Syria, well, it's about defending and upholding international law. It's about our position that we are against any international interventions and actions to undermine legitimate governments in the world. So you should analyze it first and foremost through these optics. The same thing is about Venezuela. You will find answers in the same folder than you will find on Syria. As for the NATO, well, again, it's a very interesting angle that you are looking at this. Our opposition to the enlargement of the NATO, first and foremost comes from the understanding that NATO was and is kind of a rudiment from the Cold War. So there were two blocks. One of them was Eastern Bloc, another one was Western Bloc, and there were Warsaw Treaty Pact organizations and NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Pact organizations. They were counterbalancing each other. So at some point of time, when the world was changing, there was an agreement. It was oral, it was verbal, but it was absolutely understood equally everywhere. That when we dismantle the Cold War mentality, the both pacts will cease to exist, which was the case with the Warsaw Pact, but it's not the case with the Atlantic Treaty Organization. So how do you think we should view the existence of military bloc, which is against Russia, which has anti-Russian ideology? So Russia is a foe, an enemy for NATO, and this is not a secret. And this bloc has a lot of military installations in the nearest proximity of Russian borders. Of course, you can look at this issue through another angle. You can say that our country has placed itself in the nearest proximity of NATO borders, of NATO bases, but that's not how we analyze it. So there are military people in my country who need to assess threats and to counter threats. And of course, they can't ignore the fact that a very powerful military bloc, whose military expenditure is tens of times more than military expenditure of Russia. This bloc is aggressive, and this bloc is there. So it has absolutely nothing to do with Cold War. It has absolutely nothing to do with Second World War. It's the reality that we face, and we need to analyze these challenges through what we have today.
And
for Syria, I partially answered, but we'll come to this one in Syria.
Any other questions on the theme of our
History.
press conference?
Yeah.
Maria, maybe.
Thank you, Theodore. Yeah, my question is about the celebration which is Russia preparing right now for the next year of Victory Day celebration, 9th of May, and 17 leaders already confirmed their participation in this event. I wonder if Russian authorities are going to invite United Nations Secretary General to this.
I think it was already announced that he is invited. I think it was announced. Really, I need to check, but I think it was announced during his visit to Russia. I also need to check. I'm not 100% sure, but of course he's most welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. It's well known that the rise of Nazism came as a result of the unfair treatment in Versailles 100 years ago, when that treaty treated Germany like a bankrupt country. Also, the promiscuous use of sanctions, which is, we are witnessing these days that sanctions are imposed against many countries at the same time. Are we repeating history hereby? And of course, trade wars at that time, which prevailed. Do you view that the world today is repeating what happened before Versailles and after Versailles? Without Versailles, probably there wouldn't have been a Nazi party ruling Germany.
I don't see any direct parallels, because if we assume that we live in the same times, then as in Versailles there should be a defeated party that would be faced with certain reparations and unfair conditions and limitations for the development of its armed forces and so on and so forth. But this is not the case. I don't know, maybe Japan still is limited in development of its armed forces. But you are right in the fact that there are very many alarming signals that we have today, and it's the policy of exclusion, of sanctions, of making coalitions that is really very erroneous in our understanding. So we are in favor of multilateralism. We think that we can deal with the problems of today by creating unions inclusive unions, not exclusive unions. And we don't want to guarantee security of some states at the expense of other states. This would be a mistake to do so. And there are a lot of trends like this happening today. So I think that your position that we face some situation that might be similar to that of Versailles, of something on the eve of a big war, that there are some tells that which would indicate that really we are in a dangerous situation right now. For us, it's rather the tolerance to this global glorification of neo-Nazis that we see in the world that is the most alarming. Because if we don't take this at face value, if we don't say that we do not tolerate these things, then we will all face big problems in the future. And there shouldn't be double standards in this regard. I remember, again, when I was working in Poland, and the government in Ukraine was a different one, there was so much criticism about glorification of Bandera and those who worked with him, because of so many Poles that they killed and so many massacres that they committed, and against the Jews, against Russians, against Poles. So people were saying this freely, and it was a big issue in Polish-Ukrainian relations at this time. But then, when the the tide changed. Glorification became more intense. There are more and more monuments to Bandera, to Shukhevich, and to others in Ukraine. But the voice of Poland has become kind of very soft, you know. We have certain documents about this. I can, for example, quote the letter that was recently sent by ambassadors of Poland and Israel in Kiev to the mayor of Ivano-Frankivsk in Ivano-Frankovsk in Ukraine. It's against the unveiling of the monument to Roman Shukhevich on the 24th of May of this year. And in this letter it is said, we take the opportunity to protest your decision and wish to remind the kids of Ivano-Frankovsk, their parents and grandparents, that Roman Shukhevich was personally responsible for taking the lives of tens of thousands of their equals by bullets, fire, rape, torture, and other beastly methods, only because they prayed to God in Polish or Hebrew. This is in a letter. This letter is not publicized. I downloaded it from the internet, from Twitter of some people who really also think that glorification of Nazism is something very shameful. But have you heard anything about this in mass media? Nothing. Absolutely. This is very serious. So the attitude changes. And political games, political aims start to dominate certain assessment of what's happening or not happening. And this is very tragic, really.
A quick follow-up on this. Some countries, of course, and some communities claimed compensation from Germany as a result of the atrocities committed against them. However, you have paid the heftiest price for the war, 27 million, as your statistics show. However, you did not claim any compensation. Why is that?
The best compensation for us would be a peaceful world without wars, and where people really can cooperate and not fight. So that was in the middle of our ideology all over the time. But I really don't remember. Maybe there were some compensations and reparations. I think there were some reparations in terms of land. Germany lost a big part of its territory, mostly to Poland. But Kaliningrad Oblast, I think, was also part of the land that was transferred to Soviet Union after the war. So it's kind of issue. I'm not a specialist here. I think there were some kind of compensations, but not to the extent that you mentioned. And of course, they were not formulated in treaties or something else. Yeah.
Thank you, Ambassador Stefano Vaccara, Radio Radicale in Rome, La Voce di New York. Well, I thank you for this unusual press conference, because me too, I was a student of history. Like you, I didn't remember much of dates, but
that makes best historians, you know.
Yes, but I still think like you, the history is very important, especially if we want not to repeat history. In your presentation, if I got it right, you practically saying, apart as the link with why Poland is not inviting you, Russia, and you mentioned the Pact Molotov-Ribbentrop. For your interpretation, if I understood correctly, you say at that time, years before, even before Munich, the so-called capitalist world was betting on a war between Nazi Germany and Soviet Union.
Yes.
For their advantage. So the idea of Stalin and the Communist Party in the Soviet Union was, well, we're not gonna be just the victim of the Germans because the world wants that. And so you did the Pact Molotov-Ribbentrop. And this could be, it makes sense. I mean, the logic, if I was at the place of Stalin, I could have that logic. But then there are things that you didn't mention that don't go with this logic, or at least entirely. The Soviet Union invades Finland after. And invades Finland. There is a country that, at least, is not, to me, it doesn't seem that he's dangerous, so dangerous at the moment that you have to preventively, has a prevention invasion. But you do. It's costly. It's a costly invasion. It's a war, the Winter War. And then, and so this is for me is the first thing that doesn't make sense, okay? And the second thing is that when finally Operation Barbarossa, we call it, happens in June 41, I believe, and Hitler invades the Soviet Union. We all know, at least for book of history, you can say, you know, some book of history, but the Stalin doesn't expect the invasion, at least in that moment.
Doesn't respect?
Doesn't expect. He's frozen.
Yes, yes, sure.
He's frozen. I read books
for 2 weeks, yes.
Yes,
for 2
and
weeks
he doesn't even react. Then there would be the reaction. But the point is, he doesn't expect at that moment. Maybe he's expecting 6 months later, 1 year later, who knows, but not then. So these are the two things that, for your story that you told us, to me, instead, because my interpretation of history when there is a war is much more, I would say, more simple. There are not really, I mean, yes, the history is written by the winners, but really crime are committed by all the nations during war. And in fact, Stalin and Soviet Union committed a lot of crimes during the war. United States committed a lot of crimes. So I don't give, I mean, I thought there is the responsibility who started the war, and that's for sure is with Nazi Germany. I'm not tend to say then who is good and who is bad. At war, all are bad. So my question is that there is two questions there. He said, if you, like I believe, you missed some part of the history of 39, 1940, and second thing is, and this is to my colleague, that she was mentioning that there is something strange happening. That is true, that you're talking a lot about the scare of new Nazism and but then in Western Europe, and not only in France, also in Italy, I would say, there are signs that at least Russia and Moscow has been, I don't want to use the word supportive, but at least has been non-neutral on these parties. And my question here is very direct, because this party are considered anti-European, anti-Union, European Union. Does, and here I ask a modern historian, ask the question to the ambassador, does Russia think that weak Europe is a safer, you know, is better for the interests of Russia, for its safety of Russia, or he thinks that a strong Europe it will be better for to not repeat history itself?
I'll start with your permission from the last part, because first of all I have bad memory, so I remember it better than the first one. But it's a joke, of course. Well, not in our wildest dreams. We want to have a weak Europe. We want to have a strong Europe, but we want Russia to be part of this Europe. And it comes that not very many European countries are really thinking this way, especially after the enlargement in 2004 with the accession of Eastern European states. The rhetoric has changed a lot. So Russia has clearly being portrayed as an enemy in many countries, especially Eastern European countries, and the voice of former Western European countries has also changed, because this is common European position, sanctions, so on and so forth. Of course, I'm not trying to tackle the issue why it is so, because this is a very complicated issue and we can spend 3 hours here discussing, and I think maybe we will need a bottle of vodka to understand each other better. But I don't have vodka in front of me, so I will be sober. Again, the answer is we respond, first of all, we do not support far-right movements. Support is a very strong word. We react to the attitude that this or that party has towards Russia. If a party says, like Le Pen's party, that she is understanding what Russia is doing, why Russia is doing, that Russia is treated unfairly, so it's kind of echoing what we are saying in the world. It would be very strange for us to say, oh, this is a bad party. We don't like this party. Because in France, some people say that this is extremist. This is not the reason for us. We judge the people from the things they say or do vis-à-vis Russia. And this is a big difference. Again, I haven't heard any examples of us being sympathetic with extreme far-right and with neo-Nazi parties, which, as far as I understand, are very marginal in European countries. So our position here is absolutely clear and unambiguous. As it's a very good question from historian to historian about the events of 1940 and 1939. Again, we need to a little bit adapt our understanding of what has happened by imagining what people at this time were thinking, how they lived, what were their priorities, and what was the optics that they were using for this or that situation. Finland, as you know, was formerly part of Russian Empire, and the border between Finland, the independent Finland, and Russia was very close to Leningrad, to St. Petersburg now. The cities of Vyborg that we have now in Russian Federation, they belong to Finland. And of course, it's not a reason for starting a war because of this. There are a lot of situations when capitals are on the border. But the rhetoric that we heard from the Finns at this point, and the fact that the Finns were not neutral in this regard, brought Stalin, I'm not justifying his actions, I just try to find reasoning for this, brought Stalin to the conclusion that if the war starts, and if, which was very much predictable, Finland is part of the coalition with the Reich, then Leningrad, which was very important and still very important industrial hub for Soviet Union, now for Russia, Leningrad will fall within several days. So tactically, he had to. He tried, of course, negotiations. He tried to make Finland neutral, but he didn't succeed. The same situation was in Baltic states, by the way. We were hoping that they would be neutral and it would have saved a lot of trouble for them. But they were not. They all agreed on certain arrangements with Hitler. So if you analyze it through this perspective, you will understand that this was kind of a defensive move. Very questionable, very tragic. You're absolutely right that a lot of people died, and our army was absolutely unprepared for this, and this is a very tragic event. But still, because of this, some people say, or for some other reasons, Leningrad didn't fall. So there was a blockade, you know, for 900 days, and Leningrad didn't fall. But the border was, because of this Soviet-Finnish war, it became further for, I think, about 40 kilometers, which was a game changer at this time. The same way, by the way, some historians are saying that as a result of this Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, when on the 17th of August 1939 Soviet troops entered Poland and the border was moved to the west, this move also saved Moscow from being taken by fascists, because we managed to build some more fortifications there, and still during this Operation Barbarossa, advance was very quick, but still there were some more resistance. And you know that Hitler really, if he started the war maybe earlier and maybe the weather conditions would have been better, he had more chances. It would not be the turning point of the war. I'm absolutely sure that still history would have developed the way it is. Napoleon took Moscow, but it didn't bring him the victory. But nevertheless, because of this, a lot of people are saying that because of this move, because of the fact that the border was several hundred kilometers to the west, Moscow was not taken. It's very difficult to prove. It's very difficult. I'm not saying that I am supporting this now. I really say that it was a right move. I say I just need to understand the reasoning of these people. And I clearly see the reasoning of these people, given the fact that they tried all the other ways. It was not the first move that we made to make peace with Hitler. It was we made attempt with many other countries, and the Brits and the French. They quite clearly indicated publicly that they didn't want to make any arrangements with Soviet Union. Did I cover all of the issues or not? Maybe I omitted some.
Maybe the last one
just
or two questions.
Maybe just if I omitted something, can you remind me?
You did cover, and thank you. I just this is a student of history to a student of historians. Do you really believe then that Stalin knew that Hitler was going to invade, or you think?
Yes, that's right.
Or you think that Stalin at one point, because that's, if his behavior, okay, he's paralyzed, he doesn't believe that this is happening. He really believed they actually could, share victory with it. I mean, the Hitler will have taken all Europe and left Soviet Union at least for some year long.
I think that's absolutely ridiculous to think so. Stalin, I think, was quite aware that at some point of time, inevitably, there will be some fight with Hitler. But he was sure that he has some more years or months, I don't know. So he wasn't expecting the war to start at this moment. And you know that he disregarded a lot of reports from our spies in other world that the war would start at this day, from Japan, for example, by Richard Zorge. But when I analyze these events, when my friends in Poland, who are not, as you might imagine, big fans of Stalin, when they ask me this question about this, I say, okay, let's distinguish between Stalin and Soviet people. Because leaders matter, of course. But Stalin, yes, he was hiding for 2 weeks, for sure. Everybody was wondering what has happened. Kiev was already taken, most of the territory was already taken, and Stalin was silent. Nobody was understanding. He was in shock, it was quite sure. But people were fighting already. And when I spoke with my friends in Poland, I always told them, look, victory for us is not victory of Stalin. It's the victory of Soviet people. Because regardless of everything, regardless of all the hardships, regardless of all the deaths and devastation that we faced, it was the Soviet people who moved this fascist machine to Berlin. And when we honor the memory of those who were fallen in Poland, they were ordinary people. They all had some life ahead of them. They had children. They had all the reasons to be cowards, but they were not. They went there and they died for the liberty of Poland in the way they understood this liberty. And they they deserve respect and memory for this. It's not about Stalin. Again, a lot of Poles saying, well, Russia brought a lot of devastation to Poland, you treated us badly, and that's why we can't be good friends with Russia. I ask them the question, were Poles treated in a different way than Russians were treated in Soviet Union? In Nazi Germany, you would say Germans are a superior race, superior nation, so they would live well and all the others would be slaves. In Soviet Union at these times, everybody went to Gulag, not only Poles. And that is the big difference. We all lived badly at this time. We all were treated in the same way. We all faced the same political and other problems. And you can't say that Russians were superior or Belarusians were superior or Ukrainians. We all were treated like Soviet people without any nationalities. And it was more important whether you were a worker or a capitalist than whether you were a Pole or a Russian. And that's a big difference. I'm not saying it's good or bad, but that makes the difference between the two countries at this time. So they couldn't at all cooperate, even theoretically, because ideologically they were very far from each other. The games were absolutely very far. And the union and some common goals couldn't be imagined at all. As a historian, I'm absolutely sure of this. Thank you. So maybe a couple of last questions.
Yeah.
I have to see.
Lenka.
Okay, thank you. I just wanted to ask you, please, how is the falsification related to the work of the United Nations? Thank you.
I think there is a direct implication because the United Nations is a product of this historic epoch, and it was possible for us to create this forum of diplomacy and multilateralism only because of the fact that we wanted to cooperate with each other. And this institution was created by Soviet Union, including with the others. So we managed to put aside all the problems that we had. We managed to put aside all the ideological differences that we had in order to find a club where we all can cooperate and the organization that would really move forward world politics and that would prevent us from any more world wars. And that was a successful move. So if the foundations of that time, the basic principles, how we analyze the history, are questioned, then at some point of time maybe United Nations will be questioned. And this is very dangerous. So there should be certain logical limit to this. Yes, back then people were different. But again, I repeat it once and once again, that you can't use to the events of that time the same optics that we use right now when we analyze historic events. It's a mistake. You need to look at the events through the eyes of people who lived in this epoch. If you take any heroes, any I don't know, big personalities, kings of Europe, Russia, whatever, and if you try to analyze their actions, they would be criminals, according to our eyes. Maybe they will be not tolerant to LGBT, I don't know. Maybe there will be very few women represented in some parliaments. But at that point, that was normal, and we need to accept it. So there were a lot of normalities that were normal at this time and that sound a bit strange today. And this is history. But this history shouldn't be turned into politics right now. And it shouldn't be the basis for division, for hatred, for xenophobia, and so on and so forth. That's why we are really putting in the spotlight these historic events of 80 years ago. Maybe the last. Can you ask?
Yeah, Carol,
Thank you.
of course.
I think it's very important that you raise this issue now, at this very moment, because there are many conditions, and I was recently given a quote by Angela Merkel, who said that the conditions in the world today are almost identical to the conditions in the world of the 1930s. And I would appreciate it if you would address the economic roots that made it possible for Nazism to arise. The Holocaust Museum in Washington said that 23 million Germans were on the verge of starvation at the time the Nazi Party came to power. Today, it's publicly known that 8 individuals own more wealth than more than half the human beings on this planet, which is an extremely destabilizing situation. So, to what degree would you identify the risks we're running today as a result of the economic instability, the collapse of the values of the former Soviet Union, the rise of what has become, at best, crony capitalism, but this is becoming a fairly scandalous situation. And the fact that the United Nations has been taking positions, and this goes back to 1991 when Resolution 678 was voted to destroy Iraq, ostensibly because of the invasion of Kuwait. But then again, you had Resolution 1970, I think it was 1973, about Libya and so forth. The U.S. is being. The question is, what are the economic similarities between the global economic situation today and that in the 1930s, and to what degree did this give rise to the popularity of Nazism in certain areas, and to what degree is this underpinning the glorification of Nazism in countries which are now...
I understand. Yeah, thank you. Well, first of all, let's be absolutely clear. Soviet Union is part of history. You can regret it or you can be joyful about this, but it's a part of history. I can only quote my president saying that, well, first of all, the collapse of Soviet Union was the biggest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. Yes, that's mostly quoted part, but the other part is not quoted at all. He said, those who don't want to reestablish Soviet Union, they don't have heart. But those who want to reestablish Soviet Union, they don't have mind. And that's really how we view it. So Soviet Union was part of history. Now we have Russia, we have other states. We support, the answer to your question, I think, lies first of all in the fact that the political context in the 30s was absolutely different from what we have now. And maybe I am too idealistic, but now we have United Nations. We have more safeguards from the war, from devastation. from situations like that. So you can't compare League of Nations and United Nations that we have now. And if we pursue, if we really fulfill what we all promise in terms, for example, of these development goals, development agenda, I think that all the many of the problems that you highlighted would disappear. Disparity, for example, for sure. Of course, this is dangerous. Of course, it does not affect, it does not improve the situation in the world in any case, but there are instruments now in our hands, and we need to use these instruments. So we're speaking not of the fact that we lack these instruments. We have them, but we need to use them, and this is a different situation. Back in the 30s, we didn't have this instrument, and that's a difference. So that's why I'm more upbeat, I'm more optimistic here. But in order not to make the same mistakes, we need not to forget about history, about the lessons it's taught us. But of course, with the correction for the context that we have right now, because there can't be immediate parallels with whatever historic events you have in mind.
But you yourself said in the Security Council, I believe it was the 22nd of August, that the U.S. and NATO spend over $1 trillion on weapons, yes, whereas Russia spends only $60 million. And wouldn't this money, if it were spent on the SDGs, be infinitely better spent? But the reality is it isn't. And the spending on the military is increasing, and the U.S. withdrawal from the treaty recently on limiting intermediate is a very dangerous development. So it seems as though there are trends that the United Nations has not the ability to control.
But that's why we're here, all the diplomats in Security Council and General Assembly, we're working to avoid this situation. And this position that I voiced there at this meeting is not only the Russian position, it is shared by many. So that, again, makes a difference. We understand that there is a problem, we understand that there is a big problem, but we have all the instruments to change this problem. To correct this problem, if we stick to multilateralism, then we have the solution. If we stick to unilateralism, then the situation might be dangerous. So United Nations is really a very important product of that epoch, a historic epoch, that is very much mattering today, and we don't need to forget about history, including in the context of functioning of United Nations and history of its formation. That was my point. So maybe let's close historic part and just a couple of moments on Syria.
Couple of questions, yeah?
Yeah, couple of questions on other matters, yeah. So again, remind me what's on Syria. Yeah.
On Syria, Russia announced a ceasefire in Idlib. Can you give us more details? Does this include any sort of exception for counterterrorism operations to continue? And also, will Russia engage with the humanitarian penholders on the draft resolution before the Security Council, now that it has announced a ceasefire?
I don't have the details of the ceasefire. I assume that all the ceasefires are kind of similar. So the conditions are kind of similar, but we have resolutions of the Security Council that clearly define struggling with terrorism, combating terrorism as our priority. So, but the most important fact is that this is not the first ceasefire, and I'm afraid not the last ceasefire. All the previous ceasefires' fate was the same. So the terrorists immediately broke this ceasefire. I hope that this one will last, but I really have doubts given the situation that is there. But let's hope, let's keep our fingers crossed. As for humanitarian resolution, well, you know, I was absolutely clear yesterday in my statement on the Security Council. There are humanitarian problems, and we try to solve these issues. But there is some similarities in the situation than when the Syrian army gets initiative on the ground, there comes another initiative of humanitarian resolution. And we question, without a lot of information, a lot of alleged facts that are being cited by organizations that work in Syria. United Nations, as you know, doesn't have presence in Idlib. That's why they can only trust certain sources that would give them information about destruction of certain objects, killing of civilians. But actually, the sources of this information are not trustworthy for us. There are a lot of organizations that clearly lied several times and that clearly produced fake news and information that was repeatedly denied by people involved. That's why we question very much the intensity of this humanitarian problem that is being highlighted by our Western colleagues. We try to engage in dialogues with them. If we come to certain positions that would correspond to the decisions of the Security Council, to the necessity of fighting terrorism, I don't think there will be a problem. But the problem is that our positions sometimes are very much different on this issue. And while saying that they want to combat terrorism, some of our Western partners, in effect, are not doing anything or doing exactly the opposite of what they are supposed to do. That makes all this story very much complicated. You remember yesterday my British colleague said that there were more babies than terrorists in Idlib. I don't know, really. It's very difficult for me to give assessment to this, but this sounds very populist and this sounds absolutely not true. Okay.
Thank you, Ambassador. On the DPRK, does Russia support the publication of the midterm report of the panel of experts? And do you have any comments?
Frankly speaking, I don't have any comments. I haven't seen this file yesterday and before yesterday, so there must be some developments. But it's not my immediate dossier. Okay?
Maybe last question by Russian media.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you, Ambassador. Actually, my question is regarding the presidency of Russian Federation in Security Council next month. Could you please uncover the priorities of Russian Federation next month, and should we expect the participation of Russian Foreign Minister in some Security Council meetings? Thank you.
I think we have all the reasons to expect participation of Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov in some of the Security Council meetings. But it wouldn't be polite of me to eat the bread of Ambassador Nebenzia, who will be dealing with journalists extensively on the 3rd of September. So I will not, and you forgive me please, I will not give you the details of our program. I will tell you that there are a couple of events that we foresee, and they are devoted to regional cooperation. And then you will learn the details on Tuesday.
Thank you, Ambassador. We invite everyone on the noon briefing, not the noon one, but the briefing which we will hold on the 3rd at 1:30 p.m. The 3rd of September. Thanks a lot.